My name is David Ray. I'm the chair of the Department of Comparative Literature, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this session and my honor to introduce our alumnus guest speaker. Stephen Melville is Professor Emeritus of Art History at The Ohio State University. He is a double alumnus of the University of Chicago, having received his BA here in 1971 with a major in History and Philosophy of Religions and a minor in History and Philosophy of Science, and his PhD in Comparative Literature in 1981. He served as resident faculty at the Getty Summer Institute in Visual and Cultural Studies in 1999. He co-curated Painting, Division, and Displacement at the Wexner Center for the Arts in May 2001, and most recently he served as let-alone visiting professor in the Department of Art History and Theory at the University of Essex. Among his published books are Philosophy Beside Itself on Deconstruction and Modernism, 1986, and Scenes, Art as a Philosophical Context, 1996. Stephen Melville is editor or co-editor of several books and journal issues, including Vision and Textuality, 1995, and The Lure of the Object, 2005. A co-authored volume called Writing Art History is forthcoming from the University of Chicago Press, and he is currently completing a manuscript tentatively entitled Thing of the Past, Lectures in Recent Art. Professor Melville has written extensively on post-war art, especially the art of the 1960s, and on a wide range of theoretical topics in art history. He notes that in recent years, Hegel has loomed particularly large for him, both as a philosopher of art and as a figure intimately involved with the history of art history. And his talk today is entitled Proving the Object. Please welcome Stephen Melville.
Thank you, David. And it's very nice to be here. When I left, it was just a committee. It's become a department. Very exciting. Given both this particular occasion and my own recent departure from the shelter of academic institution for sort of uncertain parts, it's been hard not to give into a certain retrospective mood. And more particularly, I've given into a desire to try and make what sense I can out of the fields and institutions I've moved through. So the talk is, at least at the outset, pretty directly autobiographical. I'll run over some of the same facts you just heard. Fairly informal, quite possibly a bit self-indulgent. I hope it ends up offering some points of fairly sharp focus. Given the long day I know some of you have had, I've also tried to keep it fairly short. As David said, I got my BA in 1971 and my PhD in 1981, both here at the UC. Seems to me you could put various spins on those dates, and for me it's hard to sort out what's simply proper to them and what comes with the difference between undergraduate and graduate education. But some things may be worth tossing out. During the time I was an undergraduate, talk in and around the humanities could still prominently feature the word myth, and Ernest Cassirer was still on the list of trendy people to read. By 1981, the word ideology had pretty much entirely supplanted myth, and theory, I guess you have to imagine quotation marks, had pretty much utterly reshaped the ground on which Cassirer had been visible. 1971 may also be a useful marker for a period during which the word student seemed to name a distinct political status and position that made it natural for the life of the university to spill over into the streets from time to time, whereas 1981 seems as good a place as any to locate the crystallization of a belief that the university could in itself enact the changes that were once called for in the streets. To be a student at the end of the 1960s meant, for many at least, that you could pretty much do whatever you wanted. By 1981, being a student increasingly meant gaining a professional credential. In 1971, the word modernism had no particular salience in the humanities as a whole. It was something in which one might or might not be interested. 1981 is a pretty good date for the emergence of postmodern as the name for some difficult cultural fact widely taken to be pivotal for knowledge in general and perhaps the faith and humanities in particular. Again, as David said, my undergraduate concentrations were in history of philosophy of religion and history of philosophy of science. These were both majors within the new collegiate division, which was itself formed in the 1960s, and so belonged broadly to the same institutional weave that produced history of consciousness at Santa Cruz, and I think it was reflected in such then apparently emergent fields as intellectual history or history of ideas. I mentioned this last because it's a field that in the end didn't gain the institutional purchase it seemed to be gaining in the 60s. I think it lost out at least partially to the emergence of theory. It seems to me now that these 60s style interdisciplinary majors and institutions were once predicated on and early symptoms of the collapse of a certain faith in the wholeness and centrality of the humanities. As it happened, my interest in history of religions turned out to be my introduction to the stuff of theory. On one side, the side associated with the work of Mercioliati, it invited one to make sense of the term phenomenology, so I plowed my way through Husserl and then on through Sartre, Merleau-Ponty, and especially Heidegger, and then on into the broader fields of primarily cognitive philosophy. And on the other, more anthropological side, it seemed equally to me coming to grips with the works of Claude Lévi-Strauss. The Savage Mind was a particularly newly translated text that my friends and I trotted about with and struggled with for some time, and so eventually coming to grips with the further panoply of writings that constituted first structuralism and then, unsurprisingly, post-structuralism. The history of science side was significantly different. The primary axis was more or less Aristotle, Hempel, Kuhn. Kuhn, of course, can seem to be the place where the two sets of interest intersect, but I'm not sure how important his work was to me in the long run, although it has certainly had strong impact for a time. The intellectual and institutional fate of the notion of paradigms and paradigm shifts is, I think, a story all its own, ending with their more or less strong adoption in corporate and entrepreneurial contexts, and the not unrelated expectation that any university department worth its salt ought to be continuously productive of new paradigms. As paired concentrations, these two undergraduate fields together offered, I think, a pretty decent introduction to thinking about things like objectivity, interdisciplinarity, the relations between the humanities and the social sciences, and so on. Things that started mattering to me early on and have continued to do so, sometimes with a bit of a vengeance. After a bit of aimless wandering, I wound up in another of Chicago's interdisciplinary programs, the Committee on Social Thought, which seemed at the time the natural place to keep on doing whatever it was that I was doing, reading continental philosophy and various bits of contemporary French thought that were becoming increasingly visible in a number of fields. It turned out that social thought as it was then constituted was pretty much exactly not a place to pursue this kind of thing. So I mostly floundered along on my own until Francois Meltzer, in an act of extraordinary generosity, rescued me and dragged me over to comparative literature, where I wrote a dissertation on Derrick. I should probably note, since his name is not going to figure prominently in these remarks, that Derrick Conflict was from early on the place that was somehow open to the French stuff, partly because most of it was indeed still only available in French, but also, I guess, because nobody really knew what conflict was, so it remained open to exploration. If the dominant orientation was to multiple languages and literatures, there was also a strongish sense that comparative could be interdisciplinary. Chicago was, I think, at the time, not exactly in the lead here, but it was willing enough to provide a home and resources for students with such interests. And some of us pretty quickly started saying that we did theory. That's another distinctly new locution that, like paradigm, has its own not entirely history. It was an accident more specific to the University of Chicago that there were in the philosophy department generally not interested both Paul Ricoeur and Ted Cullen, a student of Stanley Cavell's, an extraordinarily fine teacher. Both wound up on my committee along with Francois. Ted complaining the whole way about having to deal with all this European nonsense, and so forcing me to make as much sense as I possibly could. The sense of a relatively easy and deeply interesting movement back and forth between Cavell's work and theory was, I think this is fair to say, a distinct feature of this place at that time, and I'm not the only one of my cohort to bear its marks. And it's still tempting to take the question with which Cavell closes the claim of reason. The question is, but can philosophy become literature and still know itself? As presiding over my sense of what it meant to be in comparative literature, of what the comparison in question might be. Derrida's accounts of Blanchot's early impact on him give rise to very similar thoughts, but Cavell's remarks emerged out of a sustained reflection on skepticism that made and continues to make a massive difference to a whole range of issues that matter to me. These include quite prominently the ways I think about theory, but also the ways in which, and here I also have to mention the work of Michael Fried, I eventually came to take up questions about art, particularly the art of the 1960s, first as questions of criticism, and then ultimately through a much broader engagement with the discipline of art history. Now you'll notice, I think, that actual literary studies don't figure much in that history. I did take a few, but very few literature courses. My exams were, in this respect, a touch-and-go thing. I managed, and it's hard to credit this to anything other than luck, to get a job in an English department during what was, I think, a very brief moment when one could actually get a job as a theorist, quote unquote, and not really anything else. Everybody hired by the English department at Syracuse University after me did theory, but they also had some kind of proper period specialty. The 10 years I spent at Syracuse were pretty much a continuous and often very unpleasant battle over curriculum. Everybody thought somehow theory should change everything. In the end, that is, after erring and being unable to agree on any number of intellectually harder-edged proposals, we made something that was pretty transparently a map of the shape of the profession as it stood at the end of the 1980s. In this, we reflected strongly, I think, the more general institutional work of that decade, the reduction of complex lines of intellectual inquiry to matters of professional consensus, largely predicated on the reduction of the various questions raised by theory to matters of method, a shift that I think is also reflected in the replacement of the term doing theory by a general demand for something often called theorization. One piece of the new curriculum put into place at Syracuse, and probably the most interesting piece, was the development of a required entry course into the major called Reading and Interpretation. Everything about this course was fought over repeatedly, and in the end, those disputes were papered over by a course title instructors could pretty much take as they wished. For the very few remaining relatively conservative members of the department, reading in that title, Reading and Interpretation, was either an ordinary word of no consequence, or referred to what was then called, and I presume still called, close reading, over and against the second, presumably more theoretical thing called interpretation. For the theoretically inclined, these terms appeared rather differently. Interpretation was the conservative practice of making out a text meaning, and reading was the new practice presumably licensed by theory. And within this view, there was a further division that's a little bit harder to pin down. For some, the reading was what was enabled by a suitable account of your position as a reader, while for others, a reading was a way of grasping a text as a text rather than as a meaning. I realize that rather than is not exactly fair. Perhaps the easiest way to get this is to say, only slightly parodically, that arguing over a reading in the first sense meant arguing over the theorization of one's position, while for the second it meant arguing over the text. I don't pretend that I put that without prejudice. In fact, I've tried to put the weaker alternative in a way that intimates a certain, I think, pivotal confluence of professionalism, skepticism, and method that came very much to the fore in the 1980s. In my most negative moments, I suppose I think of this as the creation or discovery of my reading, that's one word, as a marketable professional commodity. It is, I think, the general professional outcome of the assimilation of European and especially French thought to the American Academy in the 1980s. And it laid down the broad ground subsequently claimed by the emergent fields of cultural studies and somewhat later visual culture. I don't think this is a happy outcome. A reading, insofar as it's distinct from interpretation, is not justified as the product of a theorized position. It is either of its object or not. There's a crucially ambiguous genitive in that last formulation that rather complicates the clean lines it appears to assert, and it will reappear shortly in another guise. No sooner did the Syracuse department manage its great transformation than pretty much everyone involved left. My colleague Bill Reddings went on to write The University in Ruins, a book deeply motivated by his experience at Syracuse, that I believe still offers one of the best descriptions of the impasses of the late modern university. Much of what I'm saying today, much of what I've been saying with increasing explicitness over the last decade, unfolds in relation to it. I made my own departure from Syracuse through, in effect, the same window I'd come in by, a brief moment where a discipline, in this case art history, was willing to hire a theorist who came with no other particular competence. It's not entirely a joke to say that I owe my job at Ohio State to Peter Eisenman's Wexner Center. Somehow the presence on campus of a building said to be deconstructive made theory seem necessary. I've been writing art criticism more regularly and successfully during my time at Syracuse than anything having to do with literature directly. And thanks to a summer camp, or institute as the NEH preferred to put it, on theory in art history, I come to realize that art history itself was deeply interesting. So I tried to remake myself as best I could as an art historian with competences in both the history of the discipline and in contemporary art, with the result that I didn't arrive at Ohio State entirely inadequate. Still, the first day I went to teach the survey was my first encounter with that course in any form. Art history is another, more complete blank in my transcript. A move of this kind had come to seem crucial because I had finally realized that in the English department, I actually didn't know what I was talking about. Now, that's not to say that I couldn't teach the classes, I could. But that I didn't know, and couldn't think particularly well about, say, what literature or what a poem was, and so on. I think I was actually beginning to catch on a little bit about the novel by the time I left. The interesting thing, in a sense, was how little that seemed to matter. These weren't questions that had any purchase on the field. They had had once. Wellick and Warren's Theory of Literature was a book that loomed large in comparative literature self-understanding and meant to get questions of this order. As did Northrop Frye's Anatomy of Criticism, the intellectual imaginations of figures like Burke and Wayne Booth tipped this way as well. The early years of French-influenced literary theory in America bear interesting witness to a moment when the term theory did not yet clearly mean method, and so was partly asked to make sense of itself in this larger field, and so found itself taken up in a variety of discussions that included stylistics, poetics, rhetoric, and so on. Most of those interests, I think, have pretty much faded away. In trying to think about why art history could field questions literary study couldn't, or at least I couldn't see literary study as able to field, I'm, of course, partly simple hostage to my own incapacities, and so I tend to tilt towards a more or less institutional answer. It seems to me as fair as any such remark can be to say that it took no particular effort for English departments to find their places in the modern university. Literature appeared more or less as a given, complete with its own history of reflection and discussion, reaching back to the Greeks, and a natural orientation to national culture. Art history, by contrast, gained its place in the university only as a result of a sustained and explicit effort at disciplinary foundation. Although we frequently enough invoke Vasari as the father or grandfather of history, his writings are in no way university shaped, and they give rise to no particular intellectual project. If they provide a foundation for anything, it's for a mix of scholarly and connoisseurial interests that were, in fact, the first general shape the field assumed. It's roughly what Hegel means when he refers in his lectures on fine art to art historians. That reference is itself relatively novel in aesthetics, and it's a measure of the difference Hegel both makes and answers to. This layer of scholarly and connoisseurial interest has never really gone away from art history. Arguably, it still plays too large a role in the discipline as a whole, but it has little capacity to articulate the field of inquiry. The forming of the discipline that we actually have is very largely the work of a number of German writers who engaged in the active proposal of disciplinary principles and so on. Heinrich Wolfman, Alois Riedel, Emil Warburg, and Erwin Panofsky are certainly the major figures here. And they were able to do so in part by making strong sense within their accounts of particular works, styles, historical moments, of elements of their own significantly philosophical formation. One part of what I found in their work was an interplay between prospects of description and interpretation that had not been accessible to me in literary study, and has increasingly influenced the way I imagine the specificity of reading. Hegel's aesthetics set important preconditions for the emergence of modern art history for a variety of reasons, among which one might mention on the positive side his strong orientation to detailed questions of both history and medium, and on the more problematic side, his notorious claim that art importantly come to the end of its history. I've tried to argue in a number of essays that this connects up consequentially with art history's capacity to engage particularly strongly and interestingly with questions of modernity and modernism. And as David mentioned, I'm currently trying to put into final form a book that he tries to work its way back and forth between the art of the late 60s and various terms set in play by Hegel. Now, there's a great deal more that could be said about those things, but I want to focus on just one deeper or at least more general Hegelian claim that's intimately related to both of these features. It's a claim that animates all of Hegel's work, but I think it's not accidental that it gains particularly clear statement in the introduction to the lectures on fine art. It reads, "Philosophy has to consider an object in its necessity, not merely according to subjective necessity or external order and classification and so on. It has to unfold and prove the object according to the necessity of its inner nature." What interests me here is the oddness of the grammar. Proof, as it's presented here, is related not to some proposition or set of propositions, but directly to an object, to prove the object. In this case, presumably the object, art. Other Hegelian cases might include, for example, the Roman Empire. The word prove is evidently being employed here in such a way that Hegel could, and frequently did, write sentences on the order of the Roman Empire is true. Such sentences evidently mean that we can, in the moment of the sentence's actual reading and writing, as both time and text somehow count here. The sentence has no grasp of Hegelian meaning as a simple freestanding proposition. Such sentences evidently mean that we can see their object in its fully articulated necessity, what it is that they actually were or are. In the cases of both the Roman Empire and art, this includes, for Hegel, their having ended as they did. Other cases, knowledge, for example, don't begin quite that way, don't have the same kind of end or ending. It's a feature of this kind of proof that it comes about as, so to speak, the passage of an object through its instances. And such larger theory as Hegel may hold, for example, in the case of the aesthetics, that art is the sensuous appearance of the idea, is nothing apart from, and is nothing other than, in the end, the working through of those passages. So Hegel's aesthetics is 1,400 pages. That reads like a history of art. There is no way to get to art as the sensuous appearance of the idea except by working through the instances. Hegel frequently says he doesn't have a method. Dialectic or speculation, as he often puts it, just is the way of the world. Thus is what we discover in attending to the world. The world, adequately made out, proves itself, is its own proper proof. I've said that the passage I've cited both reflects a general Hegelian position and emerges with a certain overdetermined distinctness in the lectures on fine art. I think one quick way to see what I mean here is to put the remark I've already quoted alongside another from a rather different context of the phenomenology of spirit. Here Hegel writes, one difficulty which should be avoided comes from mixing up the speculative, Hegelian, with the ratiocinating methods, so that what is said of the subject sometimes signifies its notion and other times merely its predicate or accidental property. The one method interferes with the other, and only a philosophical exposition that rigidly excludes the usual way of relating the parts of a proposition can achieve the goal of plasticity. I'm not going to worry about the subject, predicates, and accidents for a moment. It's that word plasticity that I really want there. It's a larger and more technical question to say exactly what plasticity means for Hegel. It's not normally recognized as a technical term for him. He uses it in interesting places throughout his work. Catherine Melville has recently focused on much of this, although not with this I'm focusing on. I hope it will suffice to say that in the particular light of Hegel's aesthetics, this word plasticity, which Hegel is using as a description of achieved philosophic argument, at least means that the speculative proposition, the sentences he writes, are formally or expressively equivalent to the classical sculpture that is for Hegel art's moment of highest and most nearly complete achievement. That is, the one means in language the way the other means in matter. Between these two thoughts about the speculative proposition, one about proof and the other about plasticity, stretches a fabric of questions about the actual stuff of thought, which can lead one to argue that if art is not, in fact, over, if its proof is still incomplete, then thought's relation to its material expression remains at issue for it. An art history oriented to, founded on, art's continuing contemporaneity makes itself out of that fabric. Its writing is both a reflection on and a continuation of it. I've been deeply interested in finding ways to follow through on this, both in accounts of recent or contemporary art and in the history of our modern art history. The general model for this kind of attachment to one's object is not scientific knowledge, it's a version of Aristotelian disciplinarity, in which an intellectual object gives rise to principles that in turn pick out that object. This circularity is the return of the ambiguous genitive in my claim that a reading is of its object. In distinction from the viciousness that undid the scholastic version of disciplinarity, this circle is presumably not empty because it is explicitly interpretive and historical. More importantly, because it is that, it's worked by the prospect of interdisciplinarity that emerges not at the edges of the field, because a field described this way has no edges, but all across it insofar as the proof of the object is always also the mapping of the limits that are the inevitable cost of its abstraction from the larger texture of thought, without which its proof is incomplete. What I've been calling a reading, what I think all that French stuff was about, is of an object at or as its limits. And I still seem to be able to make more real sense of this with paintings or sculptures than I can with, say, poem. I should probably note that as one pushes further into thoughts of this kind, the picture of circles or spirals tends to be less and less useful. One stops, for example, thinking of tradition as the deep underlying truth of the surface breaks of modernism, and instead tends to take the ruptures of the modern as the actual, active, and thinkable shape of tradition. And it seems to me we might say postmodernism is or was the forcing of that issue. Writing those sentences, it struck me that this is more or less exactly where I started in my dissertation, citing Derrida on rupture and redoubling. And if that can make me wonder whether I've done anything at all, just such repetition is also presumably part of what it means to have an object. I've been trying to sketch out a relation between reading, understood as the crux of theory, and the objectivity proper to disciplinary thought. And it may be useful to set these terms in explicit relation to what was at least once a central theoretical buzzword, problematic. This is another word that has undergone its own interesting institutional vicissitudes, but it belongs originally, to the extent that it makes sense to say such a thing, to Louis Althusser, and particularly the side of his work that was in dialogue with the French line in history of science, represented by Alexander Fleury, Gaston Bachelard, and Georges Anguille. Science, Althusser wrote in Reading Capital, can only pose problems on the terrain and within the horizon of definite theoretical structure is problematic, which constitutes its absolute and definite condition of possibility, and hence the absolute determination of the forms in which all problems must be posed at any given moment in science. It continues, this opens the way to an understanding of the determination of the visible as visible, and conjointly of the invisible as invisible, and of the organic link binding the invisible to the visible. Any object or problem situated on the terrain and within the horizon, that is, in the definite structured field of the theoretical problematic of a given theoretical discipline, is visible. We must take these words literally. The sighting is thus no longer the act of an individual subject endowed with the faculty of vision, which he exercises either attentively or distractedly. The sighting is the act of its structural conditions. It's the relation of immanent reflection between the field of the problematic and its objects and its problems. There's a good bit in that passage to work over and to argue with, but I think it makes the core connections right. I'd like to pretend it was a surprise to me to see Althusser popping up this way in his remarks, and to a high degree it genuinely was. But I've also fairly regularly taught this passage in relation to the various notions of the gaze that have been so influential and so often misrepresented in contemporary theory. Some of you who are into this stuff may be struck by how far Lacan's often cited story of the fisherman in the sardine can seem to be of a piece with Althusser's remarks. Even more dramatically than in Lacan's story, this note is to a fact of the world and not of the human subject. As with any disciplinary knowledge, the subject, if that's the word we want to use, exists only as a singularity within the field, doesn't pre-exist the object it views, but is to be discovered in the unfolding of that object. While the questions of vision and visibility are perhaps of particular interest to an art historian, it's the notions of object and objectivity in play here and across the broad range of French thought roughly contemporary with it that I'm trying to emphasize today. In doing so, I suppose I'm speaking as an art historian, but not much of art history. And so I found myself driven back onto an unaccustomed first-person singular, a version of the singularity that is perhaps the truth misplaced as a theorized subject position of my reading. Cavell writes in the early essay Music is Composed that, quote, the task of the modern artist, as of the modern man, is to find something he can be serious in, something he can read. And I should just say, I love that in. It's different from being serious about. To find something you can be serious in. For me, that's turned out to be art history. But that art history, the one I have perhaps been able to be serious in, is itself to a high degree the sum of the interdisciplinary passages that brought me to it. Its objectivity and the repeated passage beyond its limits, two sides of the same fact. So I wanted in these remarks to stay as close as I could get to the binding edge of the disciplinary and the interdisciplinary. It seems to me that is what is now left of what used to be called more comfortably and more compelling than is currently the case, the humanities. What I wanted to suggest then is that the knotting of questions raised by particular objects with those of the discipline as a whole places the discipline itself at stake in its every instance, and so in principle renders one's responsibility for that discipline absolute. The word here is, I hope, both ordinary enough and distinctly forgetting. This seems to be what one now has the right to demand of the humanities more largely, if they are not to become the more or less cynical administration of knowledge, doing and normalizing work of the social sciences. If they are not to become the more or less cynical administration of knowledge, doing and normalizing work of the social sciences. This latter seems to me the increasingly powerful drift against which we are obliged to make sense of our own activities. It's what the university now wants of itself and its faculties, which is to say what it is what we have come too much to want of ourselves. I think the actual promise and challenge of theory was from the beginning dead set against this, against, among other things, this version of ourselves. That's why it mattered, at least for a while, to do theory. That we have on the whole, I think, failed this promise doesn't, I hope, mean that it is too late